The morning mist clung to the waters of Pearl Harbor like a shroud, concealing what would become America's most defining moment of the 20th century. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida adjusted his flight goggles as he led the first wave of Japanese aircraft toward the sleeping American naval base on the morning of December 7th, 1941. Below him, the Pacific Fleet lay anchored in what they believed was sanctuary, their crews enjoying the peaceful Sunday morning that would soon shatter into fragments of steel and flame. At 07:55 hours, the first bombs fell like deadly rain upon Battleship Row. The USS Arizona, a Pennsylvania-class battleship that had served with distinction since 1916, became the first victim of what would be remembered as one of history's most devastating surprise attacks. Seaman First Class. James Rasmussen was polishing brass fittings on the forward deck when the world exploded around him. The concussion from the first bomb threw him against the superstructure, his ears ringing with a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his days. "This is no drill! This is no drill!" The words crackled over the ship's communications system as Captain Franklin van Valkenburg rushed to his battle station. The Japanese had achieved complete tactical surprise, catching the American Pacific Fleet in their most vulnerable moment. The attack had been meticulously planned by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who understood that crippling the American naval presence in the Pacific was Japan's only hope of establishing dominance in the region. According to historical records maintained by the National Archives, the Japanese launched their attack in two distinct waves, with 183 aircraft in the first assault and 170 in the second. The sight that greeted the American sailors was unlike anything they had ever witnessed. Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers skimmed across the harbor's surface like deadly dragonflies, their payloads aimed at the heart of America's naval power. Lieutenant Commander Samuel Fuqua, the USS Arizona's damage control officer, found himself thrust into a nightmare of twisted metal and roaring flames. The ship's forward magazines had detonated in a spectacular explosion that lifted the 32,000-ton vessel partially out of the water before settling back into what would become her eternal grave. In those first moments of chaos, ordinary, men were called upon to perform extraordinary acts of heroism. The surprise was complete, but the American response was swift. Despite the confusion and devastation, sailors and officers began organizing defensive measures. Anti-aircraft guns that had been secured for the peaceful Sunday morning were hastily manned by crews who had never imagined they would face combat in their home port. The USS Nevada, under the command of Lieutenant Commander Francis Thomas, attempted to get underway, becoming the only battleship to leave her berth during the attack. As black smoke billowed across the harbor and the acrid smell of burning oil filled the air, the magnitude of the disaster became apparent. This was not merely a military assault. It was a moment that would transform the United States from a reluctant observer of world conflict into an active participant in the greatest war in human history. The USS Oklahoma, a Nevada-class battleship, became a tomb for 429 sailors as she capsized under the weight of multiple torpedo strikes. Seaman Second Class Stephen Bauer Young found himself trapped in a compartment that was rapidly filling with oil-contaminated seawater. The ship's list grew steeper with each passing moment, and what had been the floor was now becoming a wall. In the darkness, he could hear the voices of his shipmates calling for help, their words echoing through the twisted steel corridors of their dying vessel. Above deck, Chief Petty Officer John William Finn had positioned himself at a .50 caliber machine gun despite suffering multiple wounds from strafing aircraft. Blood streamed down his face and arms, but his determination never wavered. For over 2 hours, he maintained his position, firing at the Japanese aircraft with a precision born of desperation and duty. His actions would later earn him the Medal of Honor, but in those moments, he thought only of protecting his fellow sailors and defending his country. The USS West Virginia, under the command of Captain Mervyn Bennion, had taken multiple torpedo hits and was settling by the bow. Captain Bennion, mortally wounded by shrapnel from a bomb that struck the nearby USS Tennessee, continued to direct his ship's defense until his dying breath. Lieutenant Claude Ricketts and other officers struggled to maintain order as the ship slowly sank, ensuring that as many crew members as possible could escape the flooding compartments. Doris Miller, a 22-year-old cook aboard the USS West, Virginia, exemplified the courage that emerged from chaos on that terrible morning. When his battle station in the ammunition supply room became untenable due to flooding, Miller helped carry wounded sailors to safety, including his mortally wounded captain. Without any formal training on the weapon, he then manned a .50 caliber anti-aircraft gun, firing at the attacking Japanese planes until he ran out of ammunition. His heroic actions made him the first African American to receive the Navy Cross, breaking racial barriers even in the midst of tragedy. The medical personnel at Pearl Harbor faced an overwhelming challenge as casualties mounted. Hospital corpsmen. Third Class Robert Lee Johnson worked tirelessly at the Naval Hospital, treating wounds that ranged from severe burns to traumatic injuries caused by flying debris. The hospital, never designed to handle mass casualties on this scale, became a testament to American medical ingenuity and compassion under extreme circumstances. At Hickam Field, the adjacent Army Air Base, Staff Sergeant Joseph George ran through Japanese strafing fire to rescue injured airmen from burning aircraft. The Japanese had targeted the airfields specifically to prevent American planes from mounting a counterattack. Rows of American aircraft, parked wingtip to wingtip for security. Against sabotage became easy targets for the Japanese fighters. George's selfless actions saved numerous lives as he repeatedly braved the burning fuel and exploding ammunition to pull his comrades to safety. The USS Arizona continued to burn throughout the attack, her ammunition stores cooking off in secondary. Explosions that sent shockwaves across the harbor. Ensign Joseph Tausig, despite losing a leg to shrapnel, continued to direct his gun crew until he collapsed from blood loss. These individual acts of heroism began to weave together into a tapestry of American resolve that would define the nation's response to this unprecedented attack. As the first wave of Japanese aircraft completed their attack runs and began to withdraw, the extent of the damage became horrifically clear. Yet even in those darkest moments, the seeds of America's eventual victory were being planted by the courage of ordinary men and women who refused to surrender to despair. At 0854 hours, as smoke still billowed from the devastated Battleship Row, Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki led the second wave of Japanese aircraft toward Pearl Harbor. 170 planes, including Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers and Mitsubishi A-6M fighters, swept across the harbor like a deadly storm returning for a second harvest of destruction. The Americans, now fully aware that they were under attack, prepared for what they knew would be an even more intense assault. Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor and Second Lieutenant George Welch had managed to reach Halewa Airfield during the brief lull between attacks. Their Curtiss P-40 Warhawks were among the few American aircraft that would get airborne during the attack. Despite facing overwhelming odds, they engaged the Japanese formations with a ferocity that surprised their attackers. Taylor shot down 2 enemy aircraft before being wounded, while Welch claimed 4 kills, becoming one of the few bright spots in an otherwise devastating day for American aviation. The USS Pennsylvania, flagship of the Pacific Fleet, sat in dry dock number 1 along with the destroyers USS Downs and USS Cassin. Rear Admiral Husband Kimmel, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, watched in anguish from his headquarters as his fleet was systematically destroyed. The Pennsylvania, though damaged by bomb hits, remained afloat and would eventually return to service. However, the destroyers Downs and Cassin were so severely damaged that they were later scrapped, their hulks bearing witness to the fury of the Japanese assault. Seaman First Class Donald Ross aboard the USS Nevada demonstrated extraordinary Courage as he remained at his post in the forward dynamo room, even as the compartment filled with smoke and toxic gases. His actions helped keep the ship's electrical power operational, allowing the Nevada to attempt her famous but ultimately unsuccessful run for the harbor entrance. Ross would later receive the Medal of Honor for his heroic actions, though he nearly died from smoke inhalation in the process. The Japanese pilots of the second wave faced much stiffer resistance than their predecessors. American anti-aircraft fire had intensified significantly, and the element of surprise was completely gone. Lieutenant Memori Suzuki, piloting a VAL dive bomber, found his aircraft hit multiple times by American defensive fire as he attempted to attack the dry dock facilities. Despite the damage to his plane, he pressed home his attack, demonstrating the same determination that characterized both sides during this desperate engagement. At Ford Island Naval Air Station, Chief Aviation Ordnance Man John Finn continued to man his machine gun position despite wounds that would have incapacitated most men. The blood from his injuries mixed with the cordite smoke as he fired burst after burst at the attacking aircraft. His example inspired other sailors to maintain their positions, even when the situation seemed hopeless. The USS Vestal, a repair ship moored alongside the Arizona, became an unlikely hero of the battle. Despite being severely damaged by the explosion that destroyed the Arizona, the Vestal's crew, under the command of Commander Casson Young, fought desperately to save their ship. Young was knocked unconscious by the blast but returned to duty, and successfully beached the Vestal to prevent her from sinking. His actions saved not only his ship, but also the lives of his entire crew. As the second wave of attacks reached their crescendo, individual acts of heroism continued to emerge from the chaos. Pharmacist's mate first class Richard Mayo worked tirelessly to treat the wounded, moving from ship to ship despite the ongoing danger. His medical knowledge and compassion saved countless lives during those crucial hours when the difference between life and death often came down to immediate first aid. The attack was beginning to take its toll on the Japanese forces as well. Several aircraft had been shot down by increasingly effective American defensive fire, and the pilots were beginning to show signs of fatigue from the intense combat. Yet they pressed on, driven by their own sense of duty and the knowledge that this attack would determine the course of the Pacific War. By 09:45 hours, the intensity of combat had reached its peak. The harbor, once a peaceful anchorage, had been transformed into a hellscape of burning ships, exploding ammunition, and desperate human struggle. Commander Minoru Genda, one of the principal planners of the attack, observed the destruction from his aircraft and knew that the Japanese had achieved a tactical victory beyond their most optimistic expectations. Yet he also understood that they had awakened a sleeping giant whose wrath would soon be felt across the Pacific. The USS Shaw, a destroyer in floating dry dock, provided one of the most spectacular explosions of the entire attack when her forward magazines detonated. The blast created a mushroom cloud that rose hundreds of feet into the air and could be seen from miles away. Photographer's mate, Harold Fawcett, stationed at a safe distance, captured the iconic image of the Shaw's destruction that would later become one of the most famous photographs of the Pearl Harbor attack, as documented in numerous historical archives including the Naval History and Heritage Command collections. Despite the overwhelming nature of the assault, American defensive measures began to show increasing effectiveness. The USS Maryland, though damaged by bomb hits, maintained her anti-aircraft fire throughout the attack. Her gun crews, many of whom were manning their weapons for the first time in combat, adapted quickly to the reality of aerial warfare. Gunner's mate, First Class Alvin Girth, directed his crew with calm precision, their shots forcing several Japanese aircraft to break off their attack runs. Lieutenant Colonel James Rasmussen, commanding officer of Marine Aircraft Group 21, at Ewa Mooring Mast Field, watched helplessly as Japanese fighters strafed his aircraft on the ground. 47 of his 49 operational aircraft were destroyed or severely damaged in the attack. Yet Rasmussen immediately began organizing, his surviving personnel for whatever role they could play in the defense of the island. His Marines, though deprived of their aircraft, would serve with distinction as infantry throughout the remainder of the war. The civilian population of Oahu found themselves thrust into the reality of modern warfare. Mrs. Joseph Coate, a Navy wife living in married quarters near the harbor, gathered her children and neighbors into the strongest part of her home as Japanese bullets shattered windows and tore through walls. Her quick thinking and calm demeanor helped prevent civilian casualties in her neighborhood, demonstrating that heroism was not limited to military personnel. At the submarine base, Lieutenant Commander William Outerbridge aboard the USS Ward had already engaged Japanese forces earlier that morning. His ship had sunk a Japanese midget submarine at 0645 hours, more than an hour before the main attack began. This action represented the first shots fired by American forces in the Pacific War, though the significance of the engagement was not immediately recognized due to communication delays and the general state of peacetime readiness. The Japanese submarine force had played a crucial role in the overall attack plan, though their contribution was largely overshadowed by the spectacular results achieved by the aircraft. 5 Type A midget submarines had been launched from larger submarines for the attack, though only one would survive the battle. Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki, whose submarine ran aground on a beach east of Pearl Harbor, would become America's first prisoner of war of World War II. As the attack entered its final phase, both sides began to assess the damage and prepare for what might come next. The Japanese pilots, their fuel and ammunition running low, began to form up for the return flight to their carriers. Many of them looked back at the harbor with a mixture of satisfaction at their success and apprehension about what they had unleashed. The American response was beginning to organize itself into something resembling coordinated defense. Communications, initially disrupted by the surprise and violence of the attack, were being restored. Officers who had survived the initial assault were taking command of whatever resources remained available and preparing for the possibility of a follow-up attack or even an invasion. As the last Japanese aircraft disappeared over the horizon, at approximately 10 o'clock that morning, an eerie silence settled over Pearl Harbor, broken only by the crackling of flames and the cries of wounded sailors. The magnitude of the disaster slowly became apparent to those who had survived the 2-hour ordeal. Admiral Husband Kimmel surveyed the devastation from his headquarters, his face reflecting the weight of a defeat that would reshape American military strategy for generations to come. The human cost of the attack was staggering. 2,403 Americans had been killed, with 1,178 wounded. The USS Arizona alone accounted for 1,177 deaths, nearly half of the total casualties. These men, ranging in age from 17 to 60, represented every state in the Union and every walk of American life. Their sacrifice would become a rallying cry that would echo across battlefields from Guadalcanal to the shores of Japan itself. Captain Franklin Van Valkenburg, commander of the Arizona, had gone down with his ship. His body never recovered from the twisted wreckage of the forward superstructure. His final act had been to ensure that as many of his crew as possible could escape. The inferno that consumed their vessel. Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd, commander of Battleship Division 1, had also perished aboard the Arizona, making him the first American flag officer to die in World War II. The material losses were equally devastating. 8 battleships had been damaged or destroyed, though all but the Arizona and Oklahoma would eventually return to service. 3 light cruisers, 3 destroyers, and numerous auxiliary vessels had been damaged. At the airfields surrounding Pearl Harbor, 188 aircraft had been destroyed and 159 damaged. The cream of America's Pacific Fleet had been neutralized in a single morning's work. Yet even in the midst of such overwhelming defeat, seeds of future victory were already beginning to sprout. The American aircraft carriers, including the USS Enterprise and USS Lexington, had been at sea during the attack and remained intact. These ships would form the backbone of America's eventual counteroffensive across the Pacific. Moreover, crucial infrastructure, including fuel storage tanks, submarine pens, and repair facilities, had survived the attack largely undamaged, allowing Pearl Harbor to continue functioning as a major naval base. The psychological impact of the attack extended far beyond the military sphere. News of Pearl Harbor reached the American mainland during the afternoon of December 7th, interrupting regular radio programming with bulletins that stunned the nation. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had been briefed on the attack by Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox, immediately began preparing for what he knew would be a momentous address to Congress and the American people. The isolationist movement, which had been a powerful force in American politics throughout the 1930s, crumbled almost instantly in the face of this direct attack on American soil. Senator Arthur Vandenberg of Michigan, previously a leading isolationist, would later write that Pearl Harbor had ended isolationism for any realist. The attack had accomplished what years of political debate and international crisis had failed to achieve. It had united the American people behind a common cause. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the first wave of attackers, later admitted that he had recommended a third wave of attacks to destroy the fuel storage facilities and submarine pens. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the carrier strike force, had declined this recommendation, concerned about American counterattacks and the need to preserve his forces for future operations. This decision would prove to be one of the most consequential of the entire war, as the intact infrastructure allowed Pearl Harbor to serve as the staging area for America's Pacific offensive. In the hospitals and aid stations around Oahu, medical personnel worked around the clock to treat the wounded. Dr. John Moorhead, chief surgeon at Tripler Army Hospital, performed surgery for 36 consecutive hours, saving dozens of lives through his skill and dedication. The medical response to Pearl Harbor would establish protocols and procedures that would be used throughout the war, turning tragedy into valuable lessons that would save countless lives in future battles. In the weeks following the attack, Pearl Harbor underwent a transformation that would have seemed impossible on that smoke-filled December morning. The harbor became a hive of activity as salvage crews worked tirelessly to raise the sunken ships and restore America's naval capabilities. Captain Homer Wallen, the salvage officer for the Pacific Fleet, faced challenges that pushed engineering knowledge to its limits. The USS Oklahoma, lying capsized in the harbor mud, presented particular difficulties that would require innovative solutions and months of dangerous underwater work. The salvage operations became a testament to American ingenuity and determination. Chief Warrant Officer William Port led diving teams that descended into the dark, oil-contaminated interiors of sunken vessels to recover both human remains and valuable equipment. These divers, working in conditions that would have challenged even peacetime commercial diving operations, exemplified the quiet heroism that characterized the recovery effort. Many of them were volunteers who understood the dangers but felt compelled to help restore their fleet. Battleship Roe, which had been the scene of such destruction, gradually began to show signs of renewal. The USS West Virginia, raised from the harbor bottom in May of 1942, would eventually return to service and participate in the final battles against Japan. The USS California, also sunk during the attack, underwent extensive repairs and modernization before rejoining the fleet. These resurrections served as powerful symbols of American resilience and industrial capability. The USS Arizona, however, would remain in her final resting place, becoming an eternal monument to those who perished. The decision to leave her undisturbed was made both out of respect for the sailors entombed within her hull and recognition that raising her would be prohibitively expensive and technically challenging. Oil continued to seep from her bunkers, creating a visible reminder of the sacrifice made by her crew. President Roosevelt's address to Congress on December 8, 1941, transformed Pearl Harbor from a military defeat into a national rallying cry. His words, Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, became one of the most famous speeches in American history. The attack that had been intended to demoralize America had instead galvanized the nation for total war. The military response was swift and comprehensive. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding American forces in the Philippines, found himself facing his own Japanese assault within hours of Pearl Harbor. The coordinated nature of Japanese attacks across the Pacific demonstrated the scope of their ambitions and the magnitude of the challenge facing Allied forces. Yet the spirit kindled at Pearl Harbor would sustain American forces through the dark early months of the Pacific War. Recruitment offices across America experienced unprecedented crowds in the days following Pearl Harbor. Young men who had been content with civilian careers suddenly felt compelled to serve their country. Many specifically requested assignment to the Pacific Fleet, wanting to participate personally in avenging Pearl Harbor. This surge of volunteers provided the manpower necessary for America's massive military expansion. The industrial mobilization that followed Pearl Harbor exceeded even the most optimistic projections. Shipyards that had been operating at peacetime capacity suddenly found themselves working around the clock to replace the vessels lost in the attack. The Kaiser shipyards, using revolutionary prefabrication techniques, would eventually produce Liberty ships faster than they could be sunk by German U-boats. This industrial miracle, sparked by the urgency created at Pearl Harbor, became one of the decisive factors in Allied victory. Intelligence operations also underwent fundamental changes following Pearl Harbor. The attack had succeeded partly due to intelligence failures, and American code-breaking efforts received massive new resources and priority. The cryptographers who would eventually break the Japanese naval code, enabling victories at Coral Sea and Midway, began their crucial work in the shadow of Pearl Harbor's lessons. Training programs for new recruits emphasized the lessons learned from Pearl Harbor. Damage control procedures, anti-aircraft gunnery, and combat readiness protocols all reflected the hard-won knowledge purchased with American blood on December 7th. The peacetime Navy's emphasis on ceremony and tradition was balanced with practical combat training that would serve American sailors well in the battles to come. The transformation of Pearl Harbor from a site of devastation to a symbol of American determination represented more than mere physical reconstruction. In the years that followed December 7th, 1941, the attack became woven into the fabric of American identity, representing both the price of unpreparedness and the power of national unity in the face of existential threat. The lessons learned in those 2 terrible hours would influence American military doctrine, foreign policy, and national consciousness for decades to come. The heroes of Pearl Harbor received recognition that, while long overdue in some cases, helped establish important precedents for honoring courage under fire. Doris Miller's Navy Cross, awarded in May of 1942, represented a breakthrough in racial equality within the military. His heroism helped pave the way for the eventual integration of the armed forces and demonstrated that courage knew no color boundaries. Captain Colin Kelly, who died in action over the Philippines 3 days after Pearl Harbor, became the first American pilot to receive the Medal of Honor in World War II. Though his connection to Pearl Harbor through the broader Pacific Campaign made him part of the same heroic narrative. The strategic implications of Pearl Harbor extended far beyond the immediate damage to the Pacific Fleet. Admiral Yamamoto's prediction that Japan had awakened a sleeping giant proved remarkably prescient. The attack unified American public opinion in ways that no amount of political rhetoric could have achieved, transforming isolationist sentiment into interventionist determination virtually overnight. Congress declared war on Japan with only one dissenting vote, Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana, who had also voted against American entry into World War I. The technological lessons learned from Pearl Harbor revolutionized naval warfare and defense planning. The effectiveness of carrier-based aircraft in the attack validated aviation theories that had been controversial within naval circles for decades. American carrier doctrine, refined through the painful experience of December 7th, would eventually produce the decisive victories at the Battle of the Coral Sea, Midway, and the Philippine Sea. The vulnerability of surface ships to air attack, demonstrated so dramatically at Pearl Harbor, accelerated the development of radar, improved anti-aircraft systems, and new tactical formations. Intelligence reform following Pearl Harbor created the foundation for modern American intelligence capabilities. The establishment of the Office of Strategic Services, predecessor to the Central Intelligence Agency, reflected recognition that strategic surprise on the scale of Pearl Harbor must never again be permitted. The Magic Intelligence Program, which had provided some warning of Japanese intentions but failed to prevent the attack, was reorganized and expanded. These improvements would contribute significantly to Allied victory, particularly in the Pacific Theater where code breaking provided crucial advantages. The memorial aspects of Pearl Harbor evolved gradually but powerfully over the subsequent decades. The USS Arizona Memorial, dedicated in 1962, provided a focal point for national remembrance that transcended political and generational boundaries. Survivors of the attack, gathering annually for December 7th commemorations, became living links to one of America's most defining moments. Their testimonies, preserved in oral history projects, ensured that the human dimension of Pearl Harbor would not be lost to abstract historical analysis. International relations were fundamentally altered by Pearl Harbor in ways that extended far beyond the immediate wartime alliance structure. The attack demonstrated the global nature of modern conflict and the impossibility of American isolation from world affairs. The United Nations, NATO, and the entire structure of post-war international cooperation can be traced partly to lessons learned from the failure to prevent Pearl Harbor through diplomacy and deterrence. The economic mobilization triggered by Pearl Harbor created lasting changes in American society and industry. The role of women in the workforce, symbolized by Rosie the Riveter, expanded dramatically as traditional gender roles gave way to wartime necessity. The migration of workers to defense plants, particularly in California and other Western states, accelerated demographic changes that would reshape American politics and culture for generations. Today, Pearl Harbor stands as more than a historical landmark. It represents the complex relationship between tragedy and triumph that characterizes much of American experience. The courage displayed by individuals like John Finn, Doris Miller, and countless others demonstrated that ordinary people could rise to extraordinary circumstances. The institutional failures that permitted the attack provided equally important lessons about the dangers of complacency and the need for constant vigilance. The oil that still seeps from the Arizona's hull, visible to visitors as the black tears of the Arizona, serves as a perpetual reminder that freedom requires sacrifice and that the price of liberty is indeed eternal vigilance. Pearl Harbor transformed American isolationism into global leadership, military weakness into industrial might, and national division into unified purpose. In doing so, it became not just a symbol of a day that will live in infamy, but of the courage, loss, and resolve that define the American character when tested by history's greatest challenges. The attack on Pearl Harbor, conceived as Japan's path to Pacific dominance, instead became the catalyst for American victory in World War II and emergence as a global superpower. This transformation, purchased with the blood of those who died on December 7, 1941, stands as testament to the proposition that free peoples, when united by common cause and inspired by shared sacrifice, possess resources that no aggressor can calculate or defeat.